Yep, we are going there. Today we are veering off again onto our fifth tangent, this time for a look at the world of evolution and the origin of species by Charles Darwin. Bit of a problem with this tangent because despite being someone who is quite interested in lots of different things, biology is not one of them, and it's incredibly boring. I actually prefer Leviticus to reading about biology, and this is basically biology. What's interesting though is I did discover it's not actually called The Origin of Species. If you look it up on Amazon, it's all just listed, The Origin of Species. It's actually called On the Origin of Species, by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Very punchy. Presumably most people have heard of The Origin of Species, and you could be forgiven for assuming it's a book, but actually technically that would be wrong, because it's not a book. There were actually 6 versions of it published between 1859 and 1872. And there are some quite significant differences between those, such that I then had to go and buy this, which is a variorium. I don't know how you say that really, but it's basically, it collects all 6 versions of it and notes the differences. So it's horrible to read. You can't actually read it as a sit-down thing. It's a case of using it for reference. But yeah, so not content with having to sit through all of The Origin of Species, I then had to do this as well. It's very confusing when you write a book and then fiddle with it that much over the years. But that is actually something we're going to have to deal with for the Bible as well at some stage. But hopefully that will prove more interesting than has been the case with biology. It actually gets even worse than that, unfortunately, because The Origin of Species is pretty much just about animals. Apparently Darwin was quite keen to avoid the controversy of talk about where human beings have come from. So he then followed up with The Descent of Man, which is supposedly about us, so I had to get this and go through that as well. And it's much bigger, a lot bigger. It turns out, however, that 80%, 85% of this is also about animals, so it's even worse than The Origin of Species because it's much longer and it's mostly about the same sort of thing. This one, though, was published in 1901, so it's 123 years old, and how cool is that? Smells excellent too. Some of this, as you might expect, has not aged well. Darwin refers to lots of people as savages, albeit I guess he's slightly saved by the fact it's not clear who he's talking about as being the savages. But he does talk about women being less bold, less creative, and having less mental capacity than men. So all these modern debates that's been having about that, turns out Chuck Darwin had the answer all along. I can think of a couple of modern ladies who I'd love to see Charles Darwin locked in a room with and then see how he feels about the inferiority of women. Anyway, the takeaway from all of this is that the theory of evolution has absolutely nothing to do with the origin of life. It's just about the origins of the species as they exist today. Darwin did certainly scoff at the idea that God waved a magic wand and created all of the individual species we see running around today. But he did also say that there was nothing to stop anyone being an evolutionist and a theist at the same time. He evidently doesn't seem to have been an atheist, although that's difficult to tell. And he acknowledges in the book that there is no answer for the origin of life. He actually says he believes that all current life on Earth has descended from 4 or 5 progenitors at most, even less so for plants, and even goes so far as to say, on page 753, therefore I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on the earth have descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed by the Creator. Interesting. So as it turns out, as defined by the father of evolution himself, evolution has nothing to do with the origins of life and is a mechanism that took over after life was first created. That does, however, conflict with some bits I've seen elsewhere, quite often in conjunction with Richard Dawkins, where there's a talk of Darwin rejecting the idea of a god. And I gather Dawkins is quite a fan of Darwin and presumably has read his book, so I must be missing something if Dawkins think that Darwin is saying there's no creator when he clearly just said there is one. Very strange. But either way, regardless of what Darwin thought, it is explicitly in these books that the theory of evolution has nothing to do with the origins of life and takes over after that has already happened. That's kind of annoying, really, isn't it? Because, well, that's the interesting part of that question and the hard part of that question that we kind of needed an answer to. This obviously therefore begs the question of, has the theory of evolution been updated? After all, DNA was only just being discovered late in Darwin's life, and I think the word DNA, as I understand it, was only invented the year before Darwin died in 1882. There's also, as I understand it, Richard Dawkins is an actual evolutionary biologist, professionally speaking, and his understanding of evolution clearly seems to be that it removes any need for a creator. So there must be more to that. It seems the concept of the primordial soup takes care of this as a theory, and this is broadly the idea that back, way back, long time early in Earth's development, there were these little ponds of goo and some weird funky stuff in the atmosphere, and this got struck by lightning, and then suddenly what was physics stuff turned into organic stuff and then started growing. 4 billion years later we then have Arnold Schwarzenegger, Stephen Hawking and blue whales. Instinctively to me that sounds plausible, but from what I gather of the actual science, scientists can't even take the mini steps of doing all that now. So it's not even vaguely on the radar of capability of human beings to turn physics stuff into organics, biological stuff, to make anything grow. So there's no creation of life. I'm sort of slightly surprised at that. I kind of thought maybe someone had created an amoeba or something, but no, not even anything even more basic than an amoeba has been achieved. So the chances of it actually happening by accident actually create a problem in that 4 billion years isn't long enough for it to have convincingly happened by accident. So evolution is clearly a brilliant theory, and I think actually obviously true, to some extent at least, in the same way as gravity is obviously true. I can prove it actually with evolution because this is Fozzie. He is, I believe, a labradoodle poo, presumably conceived in some sort of gigantic orgy. But God categorically did not wave a magic wand to create Fozzie. He was created by people in order to create a dog that wouldn't drop fur all over a nice clean house. So it's not natural selection or sexual selection, but it is human selection demonstrating that those things would be perfectly reasonable and would make some sense. But still doesn't get us all the way from dirt to the Fozman. Again, though, you can't have God of the Gaps argument because it's still rubbish, but it does highlight that even though science may find the answer one day, it doesn't have it yet. So there is still very much room for God and evolution. They are both still on the table. Something else that ties into all this, I've said in previous videos that I didn't think there were any Christians out there who actually thought that the Earth was, well, not many Christians who actually thought the Earth was 4,500 years old and Noah's Ark was true and snakes were talking. But I've stumbled across this guy in a YouTube video. I'll put a link below if you want to watch it. And he's like a very smart professor type guy. Doesn't sound completely barking mad while he's saying things that are, well, saying things that kind of sound a little bit barking mad. In the video, he's sitting there next to a scale model of Noah's Ark saying it really happened. And he does at one point even go so far as to say that if Genesis, the actual creation account, were disproved, it would disprove Christianity. I must say, I do think he is mad for saying that, because that's kind of, well, science has done that already, at least disproving Genesis in terms of dates. So you've got to completely ignore science in order to have the Earth being 4,000 years old. And I don't think you can actually say that without being irrational, unless you've got some explanation for how all the dating technology is all completely wrong. And it's not just carbon dating, there's the light dating in terms of distance for the stars and all the rest of it. So it doesn't really make a great deal of sense. It just seems an odd thing to stake, that you have to have this talking snake being true, otherwise it all falls apart. And granted, no one can disprove a talking snake, but science basically has disproved the age of the Earth in terms of the Genesis account of 4,000 years, whatever it was, and he gives some very specific numbers in this video. It seems like a bit of a fail of the Christian marketing department to try and put yourself in a position where you have to prove to someone that there was talking snakes and this stuff that contradicts science, when it seems there's a perfectly reasonable case you can make that none of that really matters. Even if Genesis is metaphorical, it could still be perfectly reasonably the case that God does exist. I've since found several people talking like this, and none of them look mad, but if you don't look at them, they sort of sound a bit crazy in terms of what they're saying. And the challenge of keeping the open mind on that is particularly difficult. But objectively speaking, it's difficult when someone says something that looks irrational because they're contradicting what's pretty basic science as far as I'm aware. I thought about doing a specific tangent video just on that, but then the more I thought about it, the more I realised I don't really have much to say, because I don't think it really matters. I mean, if they're right, then God exists, and if they're not right, God could still exist anyway. They just seem to have picked a really odd fight there's no way they're going to win, surely. So I think we'll just ignore that and move on. We won't need to bother doing its own video. But yeah, we're making excellent progress in deciding what's relevant to all this, aren't we? I think we're doing very well. Fear not, though, there are some horrible, horrible questions for Christianity still to come in future tangent videos. But yeah, for now, evolution, perfectly fine, no problem, doesn't cause Christians any problem.